So we're so thrilled to bring this next guest to the Rail Talk studio. She is the excellent host and reporter on FanDuel TV, friend of the show, great bumping in the Del Mar, Christina Blacker. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, longtime listener, first-time caller. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very, very much. And I love the hat. Congratulations. The Super Corredora. It was awesome to see. I really loved her going into the race. I know we talked about it a couple mornings before out there at Del Mar. So big congrats to you, to the West Point family, to everyone involved. It was fun to watch her success.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Christina. We really appreciate that. And, you obviously do an unbelievable job on FanDuel. You did a great job on the host show as well. Were there any results that on Friday and Saturday that were particularly gratifying for you? A horse that maybe you really liked or that you had a connection to beforehand or that you had watched leading up to the race that really stood out to you? What were some of the results that really made you kind of feel validated, not validated, but, impressed?
Well, I think, as you know, and Nick, you know this too, like we put in the time, right? You watch the replays, you look at the numbers, you do all the analysis, and sometimes you're seeing the ball really well and sometimes you're not, as you just don't connect. And maybe it was just because we were at Del Mar again and it's a track that I'm so familiar with. I felt like there were a couple of horses that, as I was looking at Racelands, at Thoroughgraph, at those replays, I felt really strongly about. Sci-Fair was a horse that I felt strongly about the second I watched the Algonquin. Jazora was a horse that I watched one replay over a firmer course than what she caught in the Arc and was like, that horse is going to love Del Mar. There's just certain things that I think really suit California racing, and being able to kind of pick up on those things were very gratifying to know that I was kind of seeing it correctly with a couple of horses. But I think just in general, last year was really special. Obviously for me, for Dan, for our family, there were 6 trainers that won their very first Breeders' Cup race. We had some breakthrough trainers this year. Donica O'Brien won his first. Jose D'Angelo with that incredible hour winning 2 in a row. Watching these folks that, and especially in D'Angelo's case, the way he campaigned those horses and the patience that he showed and kind of getting horses to peak at the right time and on the big days, I really appreciate that kind of horsemanship. I loved watching Forever Young get his moment, in the sun. I think if we go back to the Derby, when Sierra Leone was all over him and those two have their own rivalry going, the Japanese horsemen have been such great sportsmen, and they've supported American racing from the Derby to the Breeders' Cup and in between. And I really felt like, he's had other big moments globally, but he needed one in America. And it was nice to see that happen for him too.
Yeah, no question. I mean, those were all, that's Joe and I had touched on a couple of them. And I was actually listening to the FanDuel handicapping show, and I heard what you said about Sci-Fair. And of course, as I talked with Joe about knowing Reagan a little bit and knowing how wild it was going to be if he won, obviously was looking forward to seeing her perform. But you mentioned that Algonquin on that show and how impressed you were with the replay. Really a departure from her normal running style based on what we had seen in her first 2 starts. And I think having that versatility obviously undoubtedly gave Irad a little bit more confidence because he was comfortable putting her closer to the lead right from the outset. So no, it was a special weekend, especially for everybody that got it done on Friday. And I think handicapping wise, talking about that, and you had some great opinions. I think what I realized is that some of these races where we have now maybe an increased amount of European participation. I mean, look, we've always had a lot of European horses in the turf races, but one of the things I took away from it is that I have to stop conceding these races to the big names, right? And I have to stop spending the necessary amount of time when I see a Precise or a Mini Hawk or, one of those, because Ethical Diamond won. And admittedly, it was a long week and there was a lot of work that had gone into it. And I thought to myself, I have no idea who that horse even is. Yeah. And went back and looked at his PPs and was like, oh God, it's the jump horse. But here was a race where I felt like Mini Hawk and Rebels Romance and Amalok locked it up. And of course, that as soon as you start to believe those things, the horses have the answers. And I felt the same way about Valentina. And I had watched a Valentina replay earlier in the year. I just felt like Precise and some of the other European horses were better. But a good reminder to everyone, when you have the depth and quality of these fields, you've got to do all the work necessary on all of them because you can't concede anything.
You do. And I listened to you a lot on your podcast as well, on In the Money, and was paying attention to a lot of that analysis just from horses overseas and, the right favorites and are we buy, sell, hold. Like I loved all of that and was listening to you guys heading into it. And I think also one thing that I've really hung my hat on, especially in Southern California with the turf races, is I think there's a really big difference between turf horses that lengthen their stride to accelerate and turf horses that turn over to accelerate. And in Southern California, you have to turn over to win. There's a short stretch. You need that turn of foot and you need to get there quicker. And, there were horses like Argos, horses like Imagination the Lady. I would have loved to see Riley Mott or Brendan Walsh win those races, but those horses, the way they accelerate, were never going to be horses I can select in Southern California. Now, when we get to Keeneland next year, that could be a completely different story, but there's these little subtleties. And as you form your opinion and as you have maybe those kind of idiosyncrasies, I think you have to stick to them. And sometimes you're going to be right. Oftentimes, racing luck might get you, but you have to just sort of stay the course after you've done the work and try to feel strongly about your opinions. I'm so mad at myself for not picking Forever Young, to be honest. I picked Mindframe in the end, and I look back at it now, I'm like, what was I thinking? I don't know how many times I said on the broadcast, if he runs back to the Saudi Cup, he's going to win this race, and especially after the scratch of Sovereignty. But that was one that I was mad at myself for not listening to myself and to my gut, sort of.
Well, and the point you made was great that he deserved that kind of moment and all the big races that he's run all around the world. He really deserved that breakout. And I just think it's so cool that he and Sierra Leone have kept on a rivalry from opposite parts of the globe now for going on 2 years. So that I thought that was really fascinating and a fitting result. I'm curious to get your take on the Del Mar experience and the crowd in general, because we talk about this a lot that everybody wants to go to the Derby. Every single person, it's a bucket list thing for racing fans and non-racing fans alike. We like the Breeders' Cup, I think, because it mostly is for racing fans and racing diehards. And, Del Mar, I think, did a good job kind of catering to that. What's your experience? Because you've hosted a bunch of Breeders' Cup, Santa Anita, Del Mar, several other places. What was your impression of the crowd and just kind of the way, the appreciation that people had for the horses that maybe you don't see at a bigger, more, commercial and mainstream event?
Yeah, I think that, Del Mar is obviously a smaller venue than a Santa Anita, for example, or like the old Belmont and especially Churchill with the amount of horses or people they can house for the Kentucky Derby. But I appreciate that for the Breeders' Cup just because it is a high-end experience. This is our Super Bowl, our Olympics, and you want to be able to get to the windows. You want to be able to get a drink. You want to be able to get to the facilities. You want to be able to move around and be comfortable. And I think that, having a cap on attendance in an environment like this, there's a cap on how many people can go to the Super Bowl. So I think it's probably appropriate when you're talking about this level of competition. And I also think Del Mar just shows off in the best way, having the weather, having the conditions as expected. You don't have any major excuses in that way where, gosh, I was at Monmouth Park the year they had the Breeders' Cup, and you could see the work that went into Monmouth. I've been to Monmouth in the summer, and it was sparkling. They painted everything was planted. They put so much work into that Breeders' Cup, and the weather really ruined it. It was hard to enjoy. So I think having the beach, having the Southern California lifestyle, the restaurants, just the town, San Diego in general, you're close enough to plenty of other kind of metropolitan areas if you want to go take that as part of your vacation. To me, I know I'm a homer and I grew up going to Del Mar, but Del Mar is my favorite Breeders' Cup. I love a Keeneland Breeders' Cup. I cannot wait to see what the new Belmont Park looks like. I'm looking forward to that in a couple of years' time. But I just think that from an entire perspective of hosting international folks, having, everybody from the States, it's the reliability of the weather at Del Mar and that venue and their experience in hosting it, I think is really key to a successful event.
Totally. And just sorry, Nick, I don't want to cut you off, but just to follow up quickly on that, the breakfast at the Breeders' Cup was really, really impressive. And the massive temporary structures they put up and, how they had the horses come out one by one and you can watch every single one train. You didn't miss anybody. I thought that was a real benefit to the fans and to the horse players, the way they did that.
It is.
Go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
Absolutely. And also we have young kids and I love for them to experience that kind of thing, like the breakfast, not only just the races in the afternoon, but realizing how global our sport is and walking around that tent and listening to all the different languages being spoken and seeing people from all over the world. And the common denominator is the horse and this competition and the mutual appreciation for each other's athletes and being fans of these people that you've never met before. To me, it's the best part of what we do is how racing can literally take you all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to look a little different, right, with the next two outside of Southern California with 3 in a row there. And, you wonder in a way, I mean, and this is just sort of me, I guess, as a racing fan and horse player saying if the Breeders' Cup isn't at least approaching some type of inflection point, because you look at some of the numbers and obviously the participation's very good, handles flat, attendance is always going to be decent. I do think the event really, as much as I love the clever marketing concepts and things like that, the Breeders' Cup is, as both of you said, it's about racing fans, right? It's for racing people. The Derby is not for racing people anymore. It may have been at some point. It's gone. It is a mainstream, wide scale, like fully appealing event. There is no doubt and I live in an area where racing is not particularly popular. But if you start talking about racing, everybody asks you about the Derby, right? Nobody has any idea what the Breeders' Cup is. So in that vein, you almost wonder if maybe there's a long-term solution for the Breeders' Cup that involves something that might be able to get us the type of horses that we're continuing to get, but maybe it's at a slightly different time of year that still incorporates the Southern California element of it, and a lot of other areas where the weather is pretty nice this time of year too. Because I just, I think the next 2 years are going to be important. Obviously, getting to Keeneland, which is the home of horse racing, getting to Belmont, where it's been too long since there was an event. I wonder, I guess, in a way, what our conversation post Breeders' Cup is going to look like each of these next 2 years. And I'm really excited to see it because obviously, like any other racing person, I love the Breeders' Cup. I love seeing these horses and people get together. The international component of it, as you alluded to, has been outstanding. And obviously seeing the Japanese runners do as well as they have and seeing how they've taken a lot of the things that we do and started doing them better, obviously is flattering, but also really insightful and makes the event that much more special.
Yeah. And I noticed a little bit this year just in watching social media, kind of in the days of the 2 championship days of racing and then following. Did you see all the collaboration between the Kentucky Derby handles and the Breeders' Cup handles? Like, to me, that was a first. And maybe I've missed that in the past. And I think in general, we're kind of in a place in racing right now where everybody's realizing, like, we need to come to the table together. We need to have a unified approach to communications, to marketing, to crisis communications. Like, we need to be together on this. And so I loved seeing that synergy between the Breeders' Cup and the Kentucky Derby this week. And I also think, to your point, just about timing, it's easy for us to sort of take for granted what has always been and just kind of keep, working ahead and following that same schedule. We have at FanDuel a couple of producers that have come in from ESPN, and they were new to horse racing, but obviously not new to sports television. And one of our bosses said to me once, after he had just kind of taken this in for about a year, he goes, the thing is, like, if you created Breeders' Cup today, let's just say you were starting it right now, would you drop it on the calendar where you have? No. Not up against college football, not up against the NFL, not up against the World Series. Like, there's I think in fresh eyes and having that kind of approach to what we do, there's some value there. And maybe there are some talks and conversations about, what can be done on the calendar to kind of massage it going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like Mike Rapoli's idea of doing it on Labor Day weekend. It's right before college football, kind of a blank space on the sports calendar other than maybe the U.S. Open. So I think that's definitely worth exploring. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows over the weekend. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the vet scratches, and there were a ton of scratches that I think you wouldn't have seen in previous years. And it's tough for me to say as someone who's not a vet and it isn't on the backstretch every day. So I'm curious to get someone like your opinion, Christina, because you and your husband Dan obviously run a very successful stable. I'm sure that you've had horses scratch before that you're like kind of borderline. You thought that they were sound and the vet says no. Where are you at on that? Because I think that there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on about this. And we are in a new normal where I think we have to err on the side of caution. But I obviously understand the frustration when you ship a horse all the way out there, there's sound going there's sound off the plane, and then the vet looks at them and they get scratched. Just general opinion. What do you think that, where do you think we're at? Is it helping? Is it hurting? And how do you think that we can do better?
Yeah, I'd say, I do have some firsthand experience with it, have been in a situation with Dan where he was confident and comfortable with running a horse that the vets scratched. And I really sympathize with the trainers and their perspective and where they're coming from, because as a real horseman, when you have seen that horse every single day, day in, day out, and you're very familiar with their idiosyncrasies, you feel like you want the trust and you want the collaboration with the veterinary team in these situations. Now, what Dan has done moving forward, and I would say that, hopefully a lot of other trainers would consider it, he's been very proactive with horses that he knows, maybe this one looks a little better as we start going faster, or this particular horse, like sometimes they're a little sore, or sometimes they have feet that bother them. He brings the vets to them when they're not pointing to a race, when he's not entered, and says, hey, I want you to come look at this horse with me, because when we get to entry day, I want you to have the same medical history that I have. I want you to understand where I'm coming from if I'm pushing back. And I think that we are in a day and age where you really have to be that way if you know you have a horse that might get some extra scrutiny. But I think we really need to support the efforts of the Breeders' Cup vets in general, because it's the practice of medicine, right? If you're a doctor, if you're a vet, you open a medical practice. It's not always black and white. And there is a lot of gray area. And maybe in these circumstances where these horses were scratched, maybe they were going to be fine, but maybe they weren't. And in horse racing, we're not in a position to live in those gray areas anymore. Like, we can't. There's zero tolerance in the public perception for these injuries. And quite frankly, for us too, like, you cannot feel comfortable sending a horse out there if you have any kind of doubt in your mind that that horse might be injured, or that rider who is, I'm the daughter of a jockey, someone's dad, someone's father, someone's sister, brother, like whoever it is. So I am really of the opinion that we do have to continue to err on the side of caution with these things. And I understand the frustration for the horsemen. I understand the frustration of the owners. I understand how, you feel like you've put all this work in to get to the Breeders' Cup and it's taken away. But I think it's also important to know, and we at FanDuel, like, we go to all those safety meetings that the Breeders' Cup put together. In the Breeders' Cup's case, a lot of these vets are going weeks and sometimes months out to look at these horses. Like, they have that medical history, and it's not one person saying yes or no. It's a team of vets. I can tell you the first day that they started to come around in California, 5 vets pulled straight no chaser out. There's a lot of people that look at these horses, and it's a team decision. And so at the end of the day, like, if that team comes to that conclusion, I don't think I'm smarter than anyone that went to medical school. Like, let's trust the doctors in here. And I really understand the frustration. But I just, like I said, I don't think we can live in the gray area. We have to be on the side of caution.
Yeah, and I like the point you made about impugning the integrity of the vets, right? I think it's a fool's errand, and I think it would be a very big problem. For example, touching on something we discussed earlier, but obviously we don't have a lot of attention on this event given the time of year. So I opened up the ESPN app Sunday morning. I may have needed to check a late night college football score, but still I opened up the ESPN app and I saw the headlines, and there wasn't anything about the Breeders' Cup. And quite honestly, I didn't expect there to be any, even though, the Classic was this great international rendition. What would you bet there would have been if a horse broke down? Right? There's a 100% chance it would have been one of the headlines. Now, I'm not also naive enough to believe that we should worry about how our sport's going to get covered. Obviously, what bleeds leads. But at the same time, I was introduced to the phrase a social license to operate, I feel like at the symposium 5 years ago or so. And at the time, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I'd heard. And as I listened more in the panel where it came up, I realized that this was coming from people with real media knowledge, with real backgrounds, with real experience with how a lot of this stuff goes. And a lot of the day that we pay the piper in this game is going to be when politicos and activists start to realize that there's a lot of money propping this sport up that is from outside interests. And the more we try to scale that back and they can use a record of poor safety, bad integrity, we're screwed. Right. And if we're doing that and we're putting horses on the racetrack that can't necessarily make it, and even if it might be a real stretch to believe that they can't do it, we have to err on the side of caution. So I agree with you completely. I understand it's very unfortunate for a guy like Kenny McPeek to send 2 horses out and they both get scratched. But, there'll be another day where Kenny will have horses in there. There'll be another day for a guy like Richard Mandella was obviously very, I thought, gracious. I thought he was realistic about the scratch of Tammaro. Here's a guy who's won, a ton of races, one of the most decorated horsemen of all time, and he gets it. They all don't move that pretty. I wonder what a set of x-rays would look like for an NFL player right now relative to how they looked back in August. These are athletes at the end of the day, but we have to let the people who've been trained and studied to be experts on this actually do their jobs.
Yeah, and I think also, I might come at it from a little bit of a different perspective being in Southern California. Like 2019 was the worst experience to go through out here. And I was dropping my kids off at school and had people say, "Oh, does your husband kill horses?" Like, no. Oh my God. It was a horrible thing to experience. And from that crisis came obviously sweeping reform and the diagnostics, but also here a major culture shift where everybody embraced it from the top down and from the trainers as well, saying, look, we all have to be on board here or we're finished. And experiencing that, I think, like you look, as you say, the reaction from Richard Mandella, the reaction from Richard Baltas, like we've been through it here. And in terms of these really big race days, like it's getting stricter by the year at the Breeders' Cup. It's getting stricter by the year at the Melbourne Cup. It's getting stricter by the year at the Kentucky Derby. I feel like we kind of had our reckoning in 2019. And now on these bigger stages where some people might not be based here, they're starting to experience that a little bit too. And it has to be everybody on board. It has to be everybody on the same page. And it has to be everybody's number one goal is safety.
Totally. And that's such a great point about like the personal experience of California, because it's been like a 180 pretty much. Now you guys have some of the safest racetracks in the world, or at least in America. And yeah, think that's a great point. And it takes a lot of inconvenience and it's a pain in the ass sometimes, but yeah, I really take that point that, but sometimes you're going to have to sacrifice for the greater good. And that is keeping horses safe and keeping the social license to operate, like Nick mentioned. All right, last question from me, Christina, just putting you on the spot right now. Who's your horse of the year?
It's still Sovereignty for me. Look, I like I said, I loved seeing Forever Young have his moment in the sun, but Sovereignty, I wish we could have seen him in there because I think he would have been sitting in the same position, right? He would have been right there and we might have seen these two really square off, and the numbers that he's put forward and the Travers performance. I'm still voting Sovereignty with a lot of appreciation for what we saw from Forever Young.
Totally. Nick, you good?
Yeah, no, you asked me before, but I'll reiterate that I like Sovereignty. I think I would choose Sovereignty, yeah. And again, a lot of the same points. I think if we had a good performance from somebody over the weekend that had a bit of a resume, but we just didn't. And, I think he's a deserving winner. I've already had people tell me on social media, he didn't beat older horses and do this and that. Well, he did a lot too at the same time. So I think it's unfair to shortchange him a little bit. And, what I'll admire about Sovereignty's campaign is that, as much as it annoyed me and other people that he didn't run in a race like the Preakness, Bill Mott got him to just keep getting better throughout the year. And I think that's a thing that's totally lost on a lot of people, is that, when you study the form as much as somebody like I do, keeping horses in form for that long, and you guys do plenty as well, it's really, really hard. Like you obviously have a horseman's background in many ways, Christina, and you look at horses every day, and Joe, you handicap as well. It's hard to keep a horse good for 8 months, right? Especially a quality 2-year-old that, was earning low 90 buyer speed figures as a 2-year-old. And now you've got to suddenly figure out how to get him 10 to 15 points faster and then continue to get better from there. And that's exactly what he did. So a real tip of the cap to Bill Mott, who would be my Eclipse award-winning trainer. That's who I would vote for on the year, with due respect to Bob Baffert and Todd Pletcher, who won a lot of grade ones. I really think that this is a year where Mott's job, specifically with Sovereignty, and the fact he won a Breeders' Cup race with another horse, that's enough for me to acknowledge. I mean, hell, he even sent a horse to the Melbourne Cup. And Parchment Party beat 4 horses home, right? I don't want to diminish that. I'm pleased with that effort.
Christina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Champion trainer?
I love that. I actually hadn't put a whole lot of thought to my vote yet for trainer, but like early kind of leanings would be in that direction, certainly. And I think in addition to the continued kind of steps forward with numbers and everything of Sovereignty, consider just what we ask these 3-year-olds to do, in that they have to be peaking as they're qualifying for the Derby too. It's not just about what happens that day and moving forward. You have to start from the beginning. And sometimes it's those races that you miss that enable that big performance moving forward. I also thought, and I know this isn't, pertinent to the voting, but just the way that Bill Mott handled the scratch of Sovereignty with such class and so much transparency, and saying right off the top, look, he spiked a fever today, we'll let you know tomorrow. Like, this is, there weren't any secrets. There wasn't any kind of hiding what was going on around there. And Dan went through it, actually. He had to hit the road right before the Breeders' Cup in Del Mar several years ago. And he said something to me that really stuck. And I think about it every time you see trainers in these interviews. It is disappointing to make that decision, but it's not difficult, because there's a comfort in knowing that you've done the right thing for the horse. And I really felt that from Bill Mott the whole time, it was probably disappointing not to run in the Preakness, but for him, it wasn't difficult because he had a next goal. And then it was, of course, disappointing to scratch this horse, but it wasn't difficult because it was the right thing to do for him.
Totally. And he made it all about the horse in the interviews that he had in the week leading up to it. And I think that's, kind of what makes him such a special horseman. Another special horseman, Christina Blacker. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Always appreciate your insight. Check her out on FanDuel TV if you haven't already. Great job on the Breeders' Cup host show. Thanks for coming on, Christina.
Appreciate it. Anytime. Great to be with you both.